If you are in the room, you are here because you want to be in inquiry into some learning and into some deepening of knowledge and practice and skill around the intersections of harm reduction, healing justice, and mental health. And we're so grateful to be together today. My name is Leora, as I mentioned earlier. I'm part of the Pacific Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center staff, MHTTC for short. We're incredibly excited about today. There's been a lot of work putting behind the scenes, putting all the pieces together. So we hope that this meal that we have been cooking for you lands well. We're so grateful at the Pacific Southwest MHTTC to be funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, and this is our disclaimer that anything said by us or by any of the faculty for today is our opinion and our opinions only. I'm Leora, she, hers. I'm here in the Bay Area, and I am part of this incredible Mental Health Technology Transfer Center staff. We are a 10-centered in our 6th year of funding by SAMHSA to provide no cost mental health and school mental health technical assistance. So that's training, learning, products, etc. We are the Pacific Southwest region, so we focus our support on the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, California, Nevada, and Arizona, which is why all throughout today you'll see most of the speakers come from our region. And we have 3 tracks. We have learning that supports the general mental health workforce. We have learning that supports the youth and young adult services and supports. That is incredible learning. And then the school mental health workforce, which I personally have the honor of leading. So this day today, the intersections of harm reduction and mental health welcomes all of you, whoever you are and however you approach and engage in this conversation. Some of you might be working in schools, some of you might be providers, some of you might be youth advocates, some of you might be folks with lived experience and living experience. Whoever you are and however you are, we welcome you, and everyone is invited to be a part of this day of learning. Part of our network is that we are, part of our network's adherence is to be really committed to language that is recovery oriented, which is so appropriate for today. And I want to invite us that today might even expand how we hold the concept of recovery. So I just want to take a moment, both the words on the left and on the right, to name that these are the principles that our center and the whole network holds ourselves accountable to in the programming that we create. And the one that I want to really highlight as your welcomer is inviting individuals to participate in your own journeys. So all of us are entering the room in many different entry points of how we understand what harm reduction is, what healing justice is, and what that might inform and invite us to be as providers or as people who support young people or people who support people. So wherever you are, as I said, that's the journey that we embrace you on. We'll be inviting Jen Leland and Maurice Bird into our opening keynote, Compliance versus Care, exploring the root questions of harm reduction, which will help frame the day. We have a workshop from 10:30 to 12 Pacific time, and then a panel honoring voices of lived experience and allyship from 12:15 to 1:45 Pacific time, a break, and then regional spotlights where we get to be in real deep listening around what does this actually look like applied to practice in a wellness center at a school, in Hawaii, in Arizona, and then we'll close. So again, please join us for all, join us for some, join us for what you need.
It's a real honor to be able to introduce our keynotes. Jen Leland and Maurice Bird both have deep and long-standing roots in transformative healing and harm reduction work. Both have honored and continue to honor humanity, autonomy, and wisdom of the folks they support in ways that so much of our society often lack. They both are visionaries, they're architects, they're sustainers of systems and services that heal. And with that said, I hand it over to them.
Thank you, Oriana. Thank you, Leora. That was beautiful. I kind of want to stay rested in that moment, just for a beat, another beat. And just say, this is our intro slide. Hello, hello, welcome. It just feels like a great privilege to be in this room of over 430 people who are in this learning journey with us, in the tensions and the grapplings, in the relationships and the networks, in all of it. So we will jump in, but I just wanted to say it's an amazing privilege to be here with you all, and to really center and honor all of our lived and living experiences. And it's an even greater privilege to be with my friend and co-conspirator and collaborator, Maurice Bird, to be in this, just to be honored to be in a keynote with Maurice. And we have been meeting over the last few weeks. And what we really want to honor is being, instead of giving you a bunch of information, hopefully being an inquiry with you, exploring some roots and principles of harm reduction, and also being in some conversations. So just inviting everyone to settle in, to drop questions in the Q&A as they come up or in the chat. And we will try our best to honor everyone's time and our own time, which you may find us kind of checking each other throughout this presentation. That's because we're friends. We can check each other out loud in the Zoom.
That's
and
right.
just like, hey, move it forward. And just trusting that what we get through, we're meant to get through, and the conversation that we need to have is going to be had today. So thank you so much for being here. I'll just do a short intro and turn it over to Maurice. My name is Jen Leland, she, her, fluid pronouns. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist. I've been working in this field for over 25 years. Lots of different places, including school-based work. I know many of my fellow school-based workers and mental health teams are here on this call today. I've worked in residential treatment centers, both harm reduction and abstinence-based. I've worked in many systems, and Maurice and I know each other from co-opening up a ketamine-assisted therapy center in Oakland, California at the height of the pandemic. And currently I'm working at the Rise Center in Richmond, California. It's a youth center started and honoring the legacies of youth organizers who wanted a place to be seen, to rest, and to be deeply respected. And I'm just naming the respect because it came through so exquisitely in the Mentimeter. So I came into the field, I wanted to do anything but be a mental health therapist and a youth worker. And that is because I spent my own adolescent and teenage years in lots of very harmful institutions, group homes, residential treatment programs, troubled teen cult programs that really centered a lot of care, a lot of coercion and control, and programs that deeply informed my reason for being so in love with a harm reduction framework. And I say harm reduction when I say harm reduction framework too, and we'll get into this, just a harm reduction framework that is spacious, that even makes a lot of space for many of the chapters of my life where I really needed abstinence-based frameworks. So I just want to say that. But yeah, I wanted to do anything but go into youth care and mental health therapy work. And then I fell into kind of a street medic, street outreach, part-time job in my early 20s, and really was introduced and invited into harm reduction before it wasn't even really called harm reduction. This was a long time ago. And was able to see and be a part of care and love for people and deep acceptance of where young people were at on the streets without judgment, with a whole lot of care and love. And it sort of cracked me open in a way as like, oh, this is everything I needed and didn't get. and really inspired kind of a lifelong commitment for me to be an imperfect organizer, persistent advocate, a messy but always authentic care worker. And it also demanded that I examine the part of me that needed healing in myself in order to engage in this level of work. And I say that continues on, right? Even this morning, thinking about coming on here, I had a moment where I'm like, oh, that's coming up for healing too, around really deeply engaging and honoring the principles of harm reduction. So this is sort of like my love letter to harm reduction. It continues to hold me, challenge me, orient me again and again and again to both the power and also the tensions of holding the both and all the time, both people and relationships central to this work, whether it's harm reduction in substance abuse treatment or mental health therapy. And I'm going to turn it over to Maurice now for his intro, and just grateful that he said yes. He really is coming from a rich tradition of harm reduction in therapy practice specifically. And so grateful that you're here with me, Maurice.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's always wonderful to hear how you talk about harm reduction and the things that we've been holding here today already. So much appreciated. So my name is Maurice Bird. He and him pronouns. I'm a LMFT as well, and I work as the director of training and business operations at the Harm Reduction Therapy Center. I've been involved in this kind of work for over 20 years. More importantly, I'm the grandson of Maybella Powell and Earl Powell, and the grandson of Arthur Bird and Dorothy Bird, and the son of Vicki Bird and Howard Bird. And I locate myself often with my family. So I'm a brother and a sister to some, and a nephew and an uncle, a very proud uncle and a cousin. I try, in my spare time, I really enjoy when I'm away from the work is finding some healing for myself. And that's usually my best healing places are in the middle of the woods, right? Where I'm next to a body of water and trying to outsmart the fish with maybe a stiff drink and a cigar. One of my favorite places to be in. I'm a person that's also born and raised in San Francisco, so shout out to folks here. Which means I've also been affected by the drug war in many significant ways, both personally, on a family level, on a community level. I'm a person who also, I like to share with folks, I'm a person who uses drugs, and I love people who use drugs. And that has sustained me in my work through harm reduction, because I would say most of us probably love somebody who uses drugs as well too. And I definitely fell in love with harm reduction because, funny enough, Jen, I don't know, I knew that part about you, but I was determined not to become someone who worked with people who use drugs. I was like, I'll never do that. And guess what? We all get called where we're supposed to be. But it's made me fall in love with harm reduction in the sense that I can be creative and I don't have to, along with for myself or other people, stick to traditional models. And I think the traditional models are just one route. And we need to be able to be open and flexible and nimble, creative to find what's right for a person. And you might hear me say this more than once, and I really want us to hold this together today, and I'll shut up in a moment, is often I think harm reduction is pitted against abstinence-based models or 12-step models. And as a person that's been a representative of harm reduction for the last 20 years, I don't feel that way. I think whatever works for somebody works for them, which means harm reduction, abstinence is also included in harm reduction. That's not said enough. I think harm reduction is awesome. thought about as moderation and many other things, which we'll talk about in a moment. But just want us to hold that and remember that abstinence is absolutely part of harm reduction as well too. I can leave it there, Gina. So we wanted to give y'all like a sort of big picture of harm reduction. I think harm reduction for each of us is something different. So we want to give you a little bit of the history. We won't spend a lot of time with this book for us to hold the framework that harm reduction is not just one thing. And in its most natural form, harm reduction really exists on a grassroots public health level. And what that means is, one, harm reduction was not created by a therapist or lawyers or doctors or your public health system. It was actually created by people like you and me. And when I say that, I mean people who use drugs, people who love people who use drugs. It was created by sex workers, people who love people who do sex work. And it was really about safety. How do you save lives? How do you prevent illness? And if you are interested in keeping people healthy as possible, safe as possible, and alive, then you're practicing harm reduction. I don't care what model you come from. Often folks that have some tension with harm reduction was saying we don't uplift those things, and I want to make sure that that's centered today. The next part of harm reduction we'll talk about here is called housing first, which I know some of us have heard about, which is also definitely a harm reduction based sort of approach. And what that means is that basics, right? People deserve housing regardless of their relationship with substances, with their mental health, with the criminal system. People deserve housing if they want it. We live in one of the richest countries in the world, and I don't think that people should be experiencing homelessness at the rates that we are at if we prioritize people's health and safety. And the roots of housing first and food equity really means that folks get into housing before they seek out treatment or change anything in their life, because we know that housing itself has a stabilizing force. Great study that happened in Seattle where folks went into housing that were drinking heavily, and over a 2-year period reduced their drinking over to 35% with no treatment models, just being put into housing. The third part of harm reduction, which is human rights. And what human rights is really based in is this radical idea to some, which means that we need to end the war on drugs, which means decriminalizing drugs, legalizing drugs in this country, because we know that when drugs are illegal, they are more dangerous and potent. Whenever the drugs are purely controlled by black market, sometimes they're more dangerous. An example is, in the 20s, we had alcohol prohibition, and more people were drinking alcohol then than ever, and more people were dying from alcohol use than ever. And it created the biggest crime wave that we've had in this country, period, to this day. Also, there's something else that's really important to ground ourselves in the war on drugs, and that is that the war on drugs is racist. It is built and designed to capture and imprison Black, brown, and poor people. I think that's fairly obvious for us to see whenever we look at statistics. The other way it's easy to see too is that they have prisons for rich people, and they have prisons for poor people. So our goal is to end the war on drugs. And the final part, which in the harm reduction movement came on last, mostly encouraged by my former mentor and supervisor, Pat Denning, is the treatment portion of harm reduction. And what that is the psychotherapy or counseling or case management. And the goal of that is to really focus on relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Focus on relationships and honor any positive change and really do that thing where we meet people where they're at. And I know you hear that a lot in harm reduction, and I want us to try to really conceptualize what that means. I think it's a go-to saying whenever we talk about harm reduction, but let's really try to understand what that means if we can meet somebody on a mental, social, economic, emotional level as well too. And I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you. I'm going to move us forward.
Mhm.
We're going to get into the principles, parts and principles of harm reduction. And really we're hoping to center harm reduction in therapy and mental health counseling, case management contexts.
Mhm. And this is what I like to call the spirit of harm reduction. If you can hold on to these ideas, often you are practicing some level of harm reduction. And I want to center this too, is if you're practicing harm reduction, if you think about it in terms of human rights and housing first, then you're actually you're practicing a form of activism as well too. So here we go. The first principle is that not all drug use is abuse, which means that drug use falls on a spectrum, and that spectrum is from people experimenting with drugs to people, physiologically or psychologically dependent on drugs. It also means that harm reduction is agnostic to behavior as well too. I'm going to say more here, Jen.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to get into this more in our conversation and inquiry, but just that harm reduction is agnostic to the behavior and agnostic as to the substance, right? That we're focusing on our relationship to the behavior, to complex behavior sometimes. And again, we're going to get into this a little bit deeper. And I also like to say it's the right to be messy. And especially, I have to remind myself in my work with young people, and maybe some of you share this, but like the adolescent development typically is messy. It's risk-taking, right? And I have to remind myself that people, and especially young people, because what it brings up in me is sometimes my protector in me. I get scared for them, right? And so I have to remind myself, like young people, we all have the right to be messy. The healing is never a linear, precise journey, right? That young people not only have the right, but it's developmentally, I'm not going to say required, but it's developmentally typical for them to be messy. It's developmentally typical for me to be messy. That we have the right to be messy, and that should not, as Marie said earlier, should not mean that we lose access to resources.
Right.
I work at a phenomenal youth center that provides so many resources to young people, and young people still use drugs at the youth center. What that tells me is that there are no place that can meet all of people's needs for survival. And young people need more resources than our systems and schools and youth centers can provide.
And that means us too, right? That means us too. So we're still working at it. I really appreciate that idea of need to be messy, because I need to be sometimes too, right? The second principle is drug use and abuse are health issues and not moral issues, and we need to stop seeing them through that framework. We had a moral model that we used during the crack epidemic where we just locked people up. Nowadays, again, sort of rooted in racism, we think about it as a disease, drug use as a disease, which means you give people treatment because it's seen as a middle class white American thing. So that means people should not be punished or denied resources for what they decide to put in their body or what they decide to not put in their bodies either. And I include that because we still have people that are required to take drugs to stay out of prison, which means if you're on parole and you're mandated to take medicine or drugs, then if you don't take those drugs, you can be returned to prison or jail. Jen, you wanted to uplift the body autonomy and right to resources here as well.
Yeah, and I talked about that a little bit, but bodily autonomy, the programs that I went through as a young person, and this is something I hold dear as a gift that I received from the harm reduction movement and healing justice work. But the programs that I went through that were really centered in a lot of coercion and control when I was a young person, I think had the best intentions,
Mm-hmm.
right? I want to say that, right? I think it was counselors that had graduated Synanon that were in their own recovery programs that started my program, and that came to some sort of recovery through coercive and controlling methods themselves, and their best intention for me as a 14-year-old was to keep me safe.
Mm-hmm.
But the process of keeping me safe included methodologies and interventions and ways of relating to me that had me leaving the program totally sober and off drugs, but without the ability to trust my own body
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
to feel safe in my own body. And so that continues to be my work now, is to recover from that. So I want to just say again, bodily autonomy, it goes along with right to be messy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It goes along with the tension that I often find myself in as a practitioner where, there is that part of me, like I said before, that comes up, that's a protector part of me. When I see young people that I love and care about so much, who I feel who might be using drugs or engaging in self-injurious behavior, or just really is struggling, and it calls up the protector part of me.
Yeah.
But what I know is that actually their safety is in learning to trust their own body, their
Mm-hmm.
own definitions of safety, their own resources that are going to work for them. So that bodily autonomy, again, we can continue to surface this throughout the day today. I'm sure it will be surfaced.
Mm-hmm.
But it's deeply honoring that people need that as part of whatever they're going through in life, in the many chapters that are going to come long after my chapter with young people in this moment. And so remembering that people need to trust their own body,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that if I go from a place of protector and I conflate protection with control, then I'm really robbing young people of their bodily autonomy.
The third principle here is people use drugs for reasons and people engage in complicated behaviors for reasons. And that's often because drugs work. If I'm feeling anxious and I take a benzo, then I might not feel as anxious. Or if I feel depressed and I use some cocaine, I might not feel depressed for a little while. Which means that we need to understand as harm is relative, and us not being the people that define it for people, but maybe with people. Do we want to add anything there, Jen?
No, I think we might want to go into a quick poll. How does that
Okay.
sound? To
Yeah, sounds great.
further contextualize these parts and principles or spirit.
Mhm.
Right? So again, these are behaviors. They could potentially be harmful. It depends on, intensity, duration, context, right? It depends on your relationship to it. I know that sometimes scrolling for hours for me, and this is a term
Mhm.
from Adrienne Marie Brown, can be like mindful disassociation, which I need after a long day, is a little mindful disassociation. And also it can be almost an obsession for me, and I can lose 4 hours of sleep. And
Mhm.
for me, that's harmful. So the
Mhm.
behaviors in and of themselves, substances, drugs, sex work, in and of itself is not harmful. We can't define what harm is for others. And this also lifts up just a second point that I want to say, that we're all bringing our lived and living experience to this conversation,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
so just inviting people like Marie said, and also young people know that we are engaging in these behaviors too. Young people know that we're engaging in harmful behaviors. And so inviting us all to honor our own lived and living experiences, and even doing a deeper invite to be in a relationship with young people around your own lived and living experiences.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that doesn't mean telling young people all everything and all the things, but it could mean just having a conversation with young people about your own relationship to change, right? What does it really take to change behavior?
Mhm.
What does
And
that mean? What does that look like? Maurice and I, we're going to go into kind of conversational mode here. So join us in our little cafecito, our little grab your tea, grab your coffee. Um, I don't know, Maurice, if you want to talk about any of these principles before we get into it.
Well, I mean, I can speak to this idea of incremental change. Um, just want to say that in harm reduction, we have to be thinking about incremental change as normal,
Mhm.
and to be clear that incremental change doesn't always end up in abstinence from a drug or a behavior. I think there's a push that happens right now that people will say we're practicing harm reduction, but we're pushing someone towards an ultimate goal, which means I don't know whose goal it is, because us as treatment providers want to feel good about the work that we do, and if somebody stops using drugs or stops a behavior, then we feel good about that. We're like, yay, we feel great. I've achieved something, and be careful about that. Change, if we think about the stages of change, change happens over a period of time, and for some people, very slowly. I've shared this before in training where I've worked with people who, when I first met them, they were drinking, 10 beers, and 3 years later, now they're drinking 3 beers, which is great, which is amazing, right? Which is just really cool, slow process that just honors any positive change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it ends up in abstinence. So we need to acknowledge change is slow and normal, in that people, it's difficult to change, and all of us can probably understand this, and in the sense that um, some of us have made some changes in our life, and it took a little time to do that. How many of us need to go to the gym today? How many of us need to, yeah, right, get our oil changed or whatever we need to do something, and it's quite normal for humans to resist change with all their might, even though they're suffering, even though there may be some suffering that's going along with them. So just uplifting this idea that change can be really slow for folks, and honoring that with people, that the change is slow.
Mhm.
How about this idea, Jen, you were thinking about harm reduction being more than incrementalism?
Yeah, so I'm going to do this both and thing again.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, harm reduction can also mean no change.
Yeah.
Or there is a saying in some of the 12-step rooms, which I really honor, which is don't just do something, sit there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So sometimes, and for me, that was really important for me in my invitation to be part of harm reduction and to be seen through this lens, is that I really was so hungry, at 18, for a place that wasn't asking me to change at all. In fact, that's what I really needed in that moment. Was after so many places that were just interested in me changing, a place where I could be and be seen and be loved and be accepted, even if I didn't change, even if I didn't make any of my treatment goals or progress goals, right? A place that was just deeply inviting. I think about to even how we settled into our day today,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
what does it mean to allow ourselves to fully just be present? So sometimes harm reduction, that's what I mean. Sometimes harm reduction is more about even our agendas for change and reducing harm. That reducing harm and our agenda for change can also be found in just no change,
Yeah.
just being with.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I'll just add something real quick, Jen, is that
Yeah.
I often tell people, like when somebody comes into my office and they're like, I'm doing sex work and I'm using heroin with needles, my first response isn't like, let's stop that thing from happening. My first response is, do you know where your local needle exchange is? And do you know how to have safer sex supplies? Because I'm prioritizing safety,
Mhm.
because we want to keep people safe as possible, healthy as possible, and alive. And that's my goal. How can I request something of someone when I don't know enough about them and have a goal in mind, which means to make your point, sometimes not changing is important and being and sitting where you're at with it is important.
Yeah. And I love seeing all the chat conversations, right? I love seeing all the chat conversations. There's a lot of learning, deep wisdom that's coming through in the chat. Reflections about change not being external. Sometimes it's not external, it's internal. So again, harm reduction is, I see it as living in these tensions, right? Between people and behavior, change and no change, right? And the spaciousness, though sometimes hard, right? Requiring a lot of reflection, examination in ourselves, a lot of work in ourselves and a lot of healing to allow ourselves to be in these tensions, to not have to have it all figured out, and to be a co-learner with the young people who we're in service to. I'm going to go forward. Yeah, I think we are wrapping up, and I actually want to give time for a little bit of Q&A and reflections at some point. But Maurice, did you want to, I feel like we've talked about this principle a little bit, but do you want to say a few more words on this?
Yeah, just to highlight this too, is that, if we're practicing harm reduction with folks, it's really about creating relationships and collaborating with folks. And so it's working with people, not on people, which also means that the relationship is actually more important than the outcome or the goal. There's actually a lot of healing just in the relationship. And if I can keep the relationship welcoming and inviting, practicing, radical hospitality or defiant hospitality with people, then there's always opportunity. There's always opportunity for folks to explore and engage in exploring their relationships with drugs and other risky behaviors as well too. So it's and this idea that it's not a pathway always to abstinence, but for some people that's what it is. And we need to really engage in exploring and holding relationships so that we can figure that out with people.
That's right. Thank you, Maurice. I actually, if it's okay with everyone, I'd love to, I'm going to show this last slide. And then I want to jump into, here we go. Then I want to jump into some Q&A and invite Leora to help moderate. I think you said there was a great question in the Q&A before we lose Maurice.
Yeah, because I have to run another meeting in a moment.
But yeah, as we wrap up, again, we talked about roots and principles. We didn't get into practices or interventions. And just honor, there's a great book, Shira Nassan, that Saving Our Own Lives, a liberatory practice of harm reduction. Just honoring again what Maurice lifted up in the beginning, that harm reduction was started by BIPOC organizers, by people in the sex trade, by trans people, by disabled, chronically ill people, by sex workers, by drug users, by young people, by anti-racist activists. I won't read the whole thing, but it's a beautiful closing in this incredible book, incredible body of knowledge that really honors and reminds me to honor the lineages that I'm here today because of the people whose shoulders I stand on and whose love I benefited from, whose love from that harm reduction lens. And so again, just really deeply honoring that. And I want to invite us to maybe move into at least one quick Q&A before we move forward.
Sure.
Thanks, Jen and Maurice. I'm going to encourage folks to keep sharing really powerful questions in Q&A. I know Jen can stay on a little bit more, so you can type some answers in. But this question, I'm going to name it because it came up in my conversation with you, Jen, when we were thinking about this keynote, which is how we hold as providers and as people who love people, the real fear of someone dying and how we navigate. There's a question particularly about like higher risk substances, higher risk behaviors for the young people and all the people that we serve. So I'm hoping you can maybe parcel out some of that as we think about care and compliance.
Yeah, good. Thank you, whoever asked that question. I'm going to turn it over to you, Maurice, because I know you want to pop off.
I think there is sometimes an belief about harm reduction that we're not paying attention to harm. And just sort of a reminder that it's built into the name, that we want to be paying attention to that stuff with folks and just thinking about it from a public health perspective. That has to be what we're talking with folks about. Any kind of risks and harms that are involved. So I'm going to treat, I mean, I think one of the questions I saw was sort of putting coffee up against other drugs that may cause overdoses. And I want to acknowledge with people, if we're going to keep it real. I always tell people just say no to drugs. And when I say no, I mean KNOW, like know what they are, know how they work, know what you want, and know your limits. And if we're talking with people particularly about drugs, we have to give them the right information and the real information. We don't need to do the DARE program and scare people. But we have to also talk about the potential risk. And you want to do that with people and not on people again. You want to do that in conversation and not looking down or talking down to folks. So, when I say safety first, I mean, I want to include that into the conversation because the risk with overdosing on coffee is a lot different than overdosing on heroin. And to be clear, you're not going to overdose on coffee, you're just going to have a bad day. And with heroin, you're going to, or fentanyl, which is the more popular drug nowadays, there's potential for death. So I want folks to know about naloxone, excuse me, and I want them to know about medically assisted treatment. I want them to know about safety as well too. One of the things that I think we do that's really wrong in our treatment systems and residential treatments in particular, and when people are coming out of jails, is that we don't prepare them to relapse. We just tell them don't do it. Or we say, here's a way to think about not doing it. And that's, to me, that's one of the more dangerous things that we can do. Because if somebody does use drugs when they're coming out of treatment, residential treatment in jails, is that the potential for overdoses is higher than any other time. Because now your tolerance level has gone down, and maybe the way you think about your tolerance levels is different. So, in short, sorry for the long diatribe, but in short, we really want to be honoring people's relationships and their knowledge about drugs too, but offering our own as well too. What do we know about the difference between coffee and fentanyl and the risk and the inherent risk in those things?
It's such a good question. It's such a vulnerable question. I think about it working with like persistently suicidal youth. What it brings up for me, what it means if I want a young person to live more than they want to live, right? That tension around bodily autonomy. What is my right here? To force or control somebody else to stay alive if they really don't want to stay alive. So I'm talking about it in this context, a little bit different than substance use, but I want to bring this up. And then I also think back to when I was also 13 years old, 12 and 13, and also really persistently wanting to not be alive anymore. And the interventions that worked for me are when they were deeply rooted, again, in care and not control. So it wasn't somebody else's discomfort with me and high risk behaviors that they felt they needed to manage or control. It was somebody who was willing to really deeply hold space for me and talk to me about my relationship to death, my relationship to being alive, my relationship to drugs and death, if I was using drugs in a way that was, giving some message that I was not caring about my life. So again, it's that tension and that spaciousness, I feel, that harm reduction offers us, and that it's not so much about the behavior, but our relationship to that behavior and the many, many layers of our relationship to that behavior. I have another story to say, but I'm not going to say it because I don't want to I don't want to take up all the time, but I just want to honor that question. And again, for me in particular, the principles of harm reduction, there are many, many practices and interventions that are really valuable too, and you'll hear some later today. But the principles, again, bodily autonomy, right to be messy, those are sort of my compass and North Star, especially when I'm activated when I'm worried about young people losing their lives that I love and care about deeply. So how do I move through my own activation and center the relationship of care versus my maybe shadow needs to control or manage, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beautiful inquiry sentences for us to land on. We said this at the beginning, that all day today, we might hear things that we agree with, we might hear things that we argue with, and we might hear things that we aspire to. And part of us actually, in a meta way, engaging in the harm reduction approach with our own selves as learners is being in our own conversation with ourselves. What tensions arise, just as Jen and Maurice invited us to hold. And we'll close. So up next is the workshop.